The 7th of December, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 planes toward a naval base in Hawaii. Within 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet has lost 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and approximately 2,400 Americans. Japan has lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. By any immediate tactical measure, it is a considerable success. By any longer strategic measure, it is one of the more consequential miscalculations in modern military history. This also requires some explanation. To understand why Japan attacked America, you first have to understand what Japan was trying to do in Asia and why America had become an obstacle to it. By 1941, Japan had been at war with China for 4 years. The conflict had begun in 1937 with a series of incidents near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing that escalated, in the way these things tend to, well beyond what anyone had originally intended. Japan had expected a short campaign, weeks, perhaps a few months. China had not cooperated. The Chinese nationalist government retreated inland rather than surrender, and what had been planned as a limited operation became an open-ended continental commitment of enormous cost. 4 years later, Japan had conquered most of China's coastline and major cities, controlled enormous amounts of Chinese territory, committed over 1 million soldiers to the effort, and was no closer to ending the war than when it started. This was expensive. It was also, increasingly, embarrassing. Japan is a set of islands with very limited natural resources. Running a modern industrial war requires oil, steel, rubber, and raw materials in quantities that a small island nation simply cannot produce domestically. Japan imported approximately 80% of its oil from the United States, which had not yet entered the war but was watching Japanese expansion in Asia with increasing alarm. American public opinion, never enthusiastic about Japanese imperialism, had hardened considerably following the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, in which Japanese forces killed somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians. The exact figure remains disputed, the fact of it does not. In 1940, Japan made a decision that would determine everything that followed. It signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally joining the Axis, and moved forces into French Indochina, the territory now known as Vietnam, exploiting the collapse of France to expand southward toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the raw materials of the entire region, all of it sat within reach, unprotected by powers that were either occupied, defeated, or exhausted. The United States responded by freezing Japanese assets in American banks and cutting off oil exports entirely. This was, from a Japanese strategic perspective, an existential problem. Japan had approximately 18 months of oil reserves. Without new sources, its military machine, its navy, its air force in China would grind to a halt, not through battlefield defeat, but through simple fuel exhaustion. The resource fields of Southeast Asia represented the obvious solution. The problem was that seizing them meant going to war with Britain, the Netherlands, and almost certainly the United States, all of whom had interests and territories in the region. The Japanese high command was not composed of irrational men. They understood, with reasonable clarity, that the United States had a larger economy, more natural resources, a far greater industrial capacity, and a significantly larger potential military than Japan. American GDP in 1941 was approximately 10 times that of Japan. They ran the war game simulations. The long-term projections were not encouraging. They attacked anyway. The reasoning, such as it was, ran as follows. Japan could not sustain the war in China without resources. Resources were in Southeast Asia. Taking Southeast Asia meant confronting American interests in the Pacific. A prolonged war with America was almost certainly unwinnable. Therefore, the goal was not to win a prolonged war, it was to avoid one entirely. The plan was to strike fast, strike hard, destroy American naval power in the Pacific before it could respond, and seize everything needed in the first few months. Then, having established a vast defensive perimeter stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, Japan would make the cost of retaking those territories so prohibitively high, in ships, in lives, in years, that America would negotiate a settlement rather than fight through it. Japan would keep its empire. The war would end, everyone would go home. It was, on its face, an entirely unreasonable theory. It had one significant flaw, which was that it required the United States to respond to a surprise attack that killed 2,400 Americans by deciding the cost of retaliation was too high. The United States did not make that decision. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who designed and commanded the Pearl Harbor operation, understood the gamble better than most of his colleagues. He had lived in the United States as a naval attaché. He had studied at Harvard. He had driven across the country and seen its factories, its steel mills, its oil fields, its sheer physical scale, the kind of scale that doesn't translate easily to a briefing document, but becomes immediately apparent when you are standing in front of it. He had opposed going to war with America from the beginning. He had said so, clearly and repeatedly, in meetings where saying so was not a comfortable position to take. Having been overruled, he designed the best attack he could and led it with considerable professional skill. He also said on record before the attack was launched that he expected to run wild for 6 months to a year, after which he could offer no guarantees whatsoever. This was not the remark of a man who believed his side would win. It was the remark of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and hoped that 6 months would be sufficient to achieve the political outcome the military could not. It was not sufficient, for several reasons. The first was that Pearl Harbor missed its primary targets. The aircraft carriers were not in port that day. They were at sea on exercises. They survived the attack entirely intact. Within 6 months, at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, those carriers would locate and sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the core of the strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan lost not only the ships, but the experienced aircrew aboard them, losses that could not easily be replaced. Japan never again held the naval initiative in the Pacific. The second was that the attack unified American public opinion with a speed and completeness that no diplomatic effort could have achieved. A country that was deeply and genuinely divided on the question of entering the war became entirely and furiously undivided on the morning of the 8th of December. The negotiated settlement Yamamoto had hoped for became politically impossible the moment the bombs stopped falling. The third was that Germany, honoring its obligations under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. This was not strictly required by the terms of the pact, which obligated Germany only to come to Japan's defense if Japan was attacked, not to declare war on Japan's behalf when Japan did the attacking. Hitler declared war anyway. It resolved at a stroke the considerable political difficulty Roosevelt had faced in asking Congress to declare war on a European power over an attack in the Pacific. America was now at war with everyone at once, which suited Roosevelt considerably better than the alternative.
The mathematics of what followed were not complicated. The United States outproduced Japan in ships, aircraft, and military equipment by ratios that made the outcome, in retrospect, difficult to describe as genuinely uncertain. Between 1941 and 1945, America built over 100 aircraft carriers of various types. Japan built 17. Japanese forces fought with genuine effectiveness and at very considerable cost to the Allies throughout the Pacific War. The island-hopping campaigns were brutal and expensive. Japan did not surrender easily. The country's military culture treated surrender as dishonorable, to a degree that prolonged the conflict significantly beyond the point at which the strategic outcome was no longer in serious doubt. By the summer of 1945, American bombing had destroyed most of Japan's major cities. The naval blockade had cut off the oil supplies that the entire war had been fought to secure. 2 atomic bombs were dropped in August. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945, approximately 3 years and 8 months after Pearl Harbor. Why did Japan attack, knowing the probable outcome? Because the alternative, as they saw it, was not peace. It was slow strangulation. The oil embargo meant that without action, Japan's military capacity would collapse within 18 months regardless, not through battlefield defeat, but through resource exhaustion. A negotiated withdrawal from China, which America had demanded as the price of resuming oil exports, was politically and militarily unacceptable to a leadership that had spent 4 years, an enormous national treasure, prosecuting that war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a plan to defeat the United States. It was a plan to seize enough territory quickly enough to make continuing the war more expensive than settling it. It was a gamble on American willingness rather than American capability.
It turned out that American willingness, once 2,400 Americans were dead on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, was not the variable Japan had assumed it to be. Yamamoto had been right about one thing: 6 months was not enough. Japan lost the war. The country was occupied, constitutionally reformed, and rebuilt under American supervision. Within a generation, it had become one of the largest and most successful economies in the world, built on trade, technology, and manufacturing rather than territorial conquest, which was, in a certain light, available as a strategy somewhat earlier.